Before speaking out against a religion, one should think several times whether it is worth the consequences that disrespect for it can cause. Yet Chief Justice William did not take into account the consequences that believers might cause, and he regretted it. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was cloaked in a solemn atmosphere, the heavy oak benches creaking as attendees shifted nervously in their seats. The faint scent of polished wood mingled with the tension in the air, and the soft whispers of jurors filled the spaces between the sharp echoes of a gavel strike. At the bench, Judge William Crowe, known for his unflinching demeanor and staunchly secular views, presided over the proceedings. Pam Bondi stepped into the room with quiet confidence, her tailored navy blazer lending her an air of authority. Around her neck, she wore a simple silver cross, unobtrusive yet deeply meaningful, a symbol of the faith that guided her life and career. As an attorney with years of experience in defending workers' rights, Pam expected this hearing to be routine. But as she took her seat at the defendant's table, she felt the weight of Judge Crowe's gaze settle on her. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Before we proceed, there is a matter we must address." Pam looked up, her expression calm but curious. "Yes, Your Honor?" Crowe gestured toward her neck, his tone laced with disapproval. "That cross. It is a violation of this court's expectation of neutrality. You are an officer of the court and should not display personal religious symbols in this space." A ripple of surprise coursed through the room. Pam blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this cross is a personal expression of my faith. It does not interfere with my duties as an attorney." Crowe's expression hardened. "Personal or not, it has no place here. I'm imposing a fine of $500 for contempt of court." Gasps erupted from the gallery, and even the jurors exchanged astonished glances. Pam could hear the distinct scratch of a reporter's pen as they scribbled furiously in the press box. The tension in the room thickened, but Pam remained composed. "Your Honor," she said, standing, her voice steady but firm, "I must respectfully object. The First Amendment guarantees my right to freely exercise my religion, including wearing this cross. This fine is not only unjust, it's unconstitutional." Crowe leaned back in his chair, his thin lips curling into a smirk. "Spare me the lecture, Ms. Bondi. This is a court of law, not a church." Pam held her ground, her eyes locked on his. "Then allow me to cite precedent. In 2013, Nadia Iweda, a British Airways employee, was dismissed for wearing a cross at work. The European Court of Human Rights ruled in her favor, declaring that such a dismissal violated her right to manifest her faith. That case sparked international attention and affirmed the principle of religious freedom in the workplace. Crowe waved his hand dismissively. "This isn't Europe, Ms. Bondi, and the neutrality of this courtroom supersedes your personal beliefs. Pay the fine or face further consequences." The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension almost palpable. Pam's heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. She met Crowe's gaze, unflinching. "I will contest this, Your Honor," she said quietly but resolutely. "Not for myself, but for every individual whose rights are challenged by arbitrary authority." Crowe's smirk deepened, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. "Good luck with that, Ms. Bondi. Let's see how far you get." The gavel struck again, the sharp sound signaling the start of the hearing. But the atmosphere in the room had shifted, charged with an undercurrent of defiance and uncertainty. Pam sat down, her mind already formulating her next move. Outside the courtroom, a brisk wind cut through the streets of Chicago, carrying the echoes of what had just transpired inside. For Pam, this was no longer about a simple hearing. This was a battle for principle, for justice, and for the rights enshrined in the Constitution. She was ready to fight no matter the cost. The courtroom emptied as the hearing concluded, but Pam Bondi lingered, sitting quietly as she organized her notes. The weight of Judge William Crowe's fine lingered in her mind, not as a personal insult but as an affront to the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution. Her silver cross rested lightly against her collarbone, a symbol of the strength she drew from her faith, a strength she would need now more than ever. Pam was no stranger to opposition, but the blatant disregard for her rights had ignited something deeper in her. As she left the courtroom and stepped into the brisk Chicago air, her resolve solidified. She would fight this injustice, not just for herself but for anyone who had ever faced discrimination for their beliefs. The next day, Pam's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was a formal communication from the Illinois State Bar Association, notifying her of a complaint filed against her by none other than Judge Crowe. The complaint accused her of unprofessional conduct and attempting to undermine the neutrality of the court. Pam read the email twice, her lips pressing into a thin line. The complaint was a calculated move, a clear attempt by Crowe to intimidate her into silence. But Pam knew the law intimately, and she knew that Crowe's actions were not only unethical but potentially illegal. Sitting at her desk, Pam opened her laptop and began drafting a counterclaim. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, each stroke deliberate and filled with purpose. The plan unfolded in her mind with crystal clarity. She would not only contest the fine but also file a lawsuit against Judge Crowe for abuse of power. Her argument would be rooted in 3 key pieces of evidence: the courtroom recordings. The official audio and video recordings of the previous day's hearing captured Crowe's biased comments, including his disparaging remarks about religion and his outright dismissal of her constitutional rights. The Iwata precedent. The landmark case of Nadia Iwata provided a compelling parallel, showcasing how international courts had defended the right to manifest religious beliefs in professional settings. While not binding in the U.S., it underscored the universal importance of protecting individual freedoms. Witness testimonies. Several colleagues, both within the legal community and beyond, were aware of Crowe's history of anti-religious bias. Their statements would add weight to Pam's claim that his fine and subsequent complaint were part of a broader pattern of discrimination. As Pam finalized her draft, her assistant, Rachel, stepped into the room, her brow furrowed with concern. "Pam, you're trending," she said, holding up her phone. Pam looked at Rachel quizzically. "Trending?" Rachel handed her the phone, which displayed a local news article accompanied by a flurry of tweets. The headline read, "Judge finds attorney for wearing cross. Religious freedom at stake?" Pam sighed. "Well, I suppose it was only a matter of time." The article recounted the events of the previous day, framing it as a potential First Amendment violation. Social media was ablaze with comments, many expressing outrage on her behalf. Some accused Crowe of overreach, while others debated the implications of mixing religion and the law. Rachel hesitated before speaking again. "Pam, this is going viral. People are already talking about protests and petitions. How do you want to handle it?" Pam set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "The focus shouldn't be on me," she said finally. "This is about a principle, about protecting the rights of everyone, regardless of their beliefs. If this attention helps bring that to light, so be it." By the afternoon, Pam's story had been picked up by national outlets. Reporters began calling her office, requesting interviews and statements. Pam declined most of them, choosing instead to focus on her legal strategy. But she agreed to one sit-down with a respected journalist known for balanced reporting. When the interview aired, Pam's composed demeanor and clear articulation of her case resonated with viewers. She explained the significance of the First Amendment and highlighted the broader implications of allowing personal biases to influence judicial decisions. "This isn't just about a cross," she said firmly. "It's about the foundation of our freedoms." The interview only fueled the growing interest in her case. By evening, hashtags like #FreedomToBelieve and #CrossInCourt were trending nationwide. As Pam reviewed the final version of her counterclaim, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer a private battle, it was a fight for something much larger. And she was ready to see it through. The momentum around Pam Bondi's fight grew with unstoppable force. What began as an incident confined to a single courtroom in Chicago had transformed into a national debate about religious freedom and judicial impartiality. News outlets broadcasted heated discussions, op-eds flooded the internet, and social media swarmed with comments, some defending Pam's stance and others questioning the role of faith in public spaces. Pam, however, remained steadfast and laser-focused. The complaint Judge Crowe had filed against her was no longer just a bureaucratic move. It was a deliberate attempt to undermine her credibility. She knew that proving her case would require not just legal expertise, but also unshakable confidence in the principles she was fighting for. As the media frenzy intensified, Pam held a press conference outside her office. The crowd gathered, reporters jostling for position, their cameras aimed squarely at the podium. Pam stepped forward, her silver cross glinting faintly in the afternoon sun. She cleared her throat, and the murmurs quieted. "This isn't about one person," she began, her voice firm yet measured. "This is about ensuring that every American has the right to practice their faith without fear of prejudice or punishment. Our Constitution guarantees us this freedom, and I intend to stand by it, for myself and for everyone who values their rights." Her words resonated, drawing applause from some of the onlookers. But not everyone was convinced. A reporter raised his hand, pushing forward with a question that carried skepticism. "Ms. Bondi, Judge Crowe argues that your display of a cross in a courtroom undermines neutrality. How do you respond to those who say that religion has no place in public institutions?" Pam met his gaze steadily. "Neutrality does not mean erasing personal identity," she replied. "It means treating all beliefs, religious or non-religious, with fairness and respect. If we allow symbols of faith to be punished, we risk setting a dangerous precedent where diversity is stifled instead of celebrated." Meanwhile, inside the legal world, Judge Crowe's reputation came under scrutiny. Reports surfaced that he had a history of making dismissive remarks toward individuals who expressed religious beliefs during legal proceedings. Former colleagues and attorneys began to speak out, anonymously at first but soon more openly. They described a pattern of behavior that aligned with what Pam was now bringing to light. Pam's legal team worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence they could find to support her case. They pored over courtroom recordings, identifying moments where Crowe's comments revealed an unmistakable bias. The parallels to Nadia Iweda's case grew stronger with each detail they uncovered. International human rights experts were consulted, adding their voices to the growing consensus that Crowe's actions violated fundamental principles of freedom. The pressure on Crowe mounted. Public opinion was shifting, and protests were beginning to form in the streets of Chicago. Pam, however, had no part in organizing them. The rallies were spontaneous, led by community leaders and faith-based organizations who saw her battle as a call to action. Pam herself stayed focused on the legal battle, determined not to let the noise distract her. In a quiet moment at her office, she reviewed the testimony of a former colleague of Crowe's, who had agreed to speak on the record. The testimony read, "Judge Crowe has always made his disdain for religion clear. I've heard him mock attorneys for their beliefs and dismiss cases that involved religious arguments without giving them fair consideration. This isn't about neutrality. It's about personal prejudice." Pam leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of those words. She knew this battle would be difficult, but with every step forward, she felt the truth on her side. This wasn't just about her cross. It was about holding power accountable and protecting the freedoms that define their democracy. As she prepared for the next stage of the fight, Pam couldn't help but think of the individuals watching her story unfold. She hoped they would see that standing up for one's rights wasn't just a legal battle, it was a moral imperative. And she was ready to lead by example. As the cold winter sun set over Chicago, a crowd began to gather outside Judge William Crowe's stately brownstone. They weren't there in anger or hostility, but in quiet solidarity. Many clutched simple signs with messages like, "Freedom of faith," and "Equal rights for all." Some carried small crosses, not as a challenge, but as symbols of their unwavering belief in the importance of protecting religious freedom. Pam Bondi had no role in organizing the peaceful protest. She was far too focused on her counterclaim, but its appearance wasn't surprising. Her fight had sparked a movement, touching a nerve with people who believed their voices were often dismissed or marginalized. Inside his home, Judge Crowe peered through the curtains at the assembly. His face was pale, his confidence shaken. He wasn't accustomed to being at the center of controversy, much less a public outcry. For the first time, he began to reflect on his decisions, the motivations behind them, and the unintended consequences they had unleashed. Meanwhile, Pam prepared for a pivotal court filing. Her counterclaim against Crowe wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a meticulously crafted case, designed to hold him accountable for abusing his judicial authority. Her legal team worked late into the night, compiling every detail of Crowe's conduct and building a narrative that was as compelling as it was irrefutable. Pam reviewed the final draft of the claim one last time. Its foundation was rock solid, anchored by three crucial elements. Courtroom recordings. The transcripts of her hearing showcased Crowe's dismissive remarks and blatant disregard for constitutional protections. They revealed not just bias, but a pattern of behavior that undermined the integrity of the courtroom. Testimonies from legal professionals, statements from attorneys and former colleagues painted a troubling picture of Crowe's history, one marked by hostility toward religious expression and a refusal to engage with differing viewpoints. The broader context, drawing parallels to cases like Nadia Iweda's, Pam demonstrated that her fight wasn't isolated or unprecedented. It was part of a global struggle for equality and justice. The next morning, Pam and her team arrived at the courthouse, filing the counterclaim that could potentially set a landmark precedent. The filing generated immediate headlines, with news outlets framing it as a bold stand against judicial overreach. Judge Crowe was now under intense scrutiny. The very court system he had presided over for years was now questioning his actions, and his once unassailable authority seemed to teeter on the edge. That evening, as Pam sat in her office, she received a message from her assistant, Rachel. "The protest outside Crowe's house is still growing," Rachel said. "The media's covering it, and it's trending everywhere." Pam sighed, her expression thoughtful. "I hope people stay peaceful," she said. "This isn't about tearing someone down. It's about ensuring that no one, not even a judge, is above the law." Crowe, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. Alone in his study, he replayed the courtroom recordings in his mind, hearing his own words with newfound clarity. The disdain in his tone, the sharpness of his comments. It was all there, undeniable and damning. For the first time in his career, Crowe questioned not just his actions but his own motivations. He wondered whether his personal beliefs had clouded his judgment, turning his courtroom into a stage for his biases rather than a platform for justice. The tide was turning, and both sides could feel it. The question now was whether Crowe would hold firm in his position, or whether he would take a step back and reconsider the choices that had led him here. The courtroom was packed as the hearing resumed, the air heavy with anticipation. Judge William Crowe sat at the bench, his typically stern expression now masking the inner turmoil that had gripped him over the last few days. The media firestorm, the peaceful protests outside his home, and the mounting evidence against him had forced him into a position he had never expected, to question his own judgment. Pam Bondi entered the courtroom with her legal team, her silver cross still resting lightly around her neck. She walked with quiet confidence, her demeanor calm but resolute. She knew that today's hearing wasn't just about the fine imposed on her. It was about setting a precedent and ensuring that personal bias could never outweigh constitutional rights in a court of law. As the hearing began, Pam presented her counterclaim with precision and clarity. She highlighted the recordings of Judge Crowe's remarks, which revealed a clear pattern of dismissiveness toward religious expression. She cited the testimonies from former colleagues and attorneys, painting a picture of a judge who had allowed his personal beliefs to interfere with his professional responsibilities. And finally, she referenced the landmark case of Nadia Iweda, connecting its principles to her own fight. "Your Honor," Pam said, addressing the presiding judge, who had been brought in to oversee the case. "This is not a fight about me or Judge Crowe personally. This is about ensuring that the rights enshrined in our Constitution are upheld for everyone, regardless of their beliefs. If we allow personal biases to dictate the actions of those in power, we undermine the very foundation of justice." The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The presiding judge glanced toward Crowe, whose usual confidence had been replaced by a subdued demeanor. For the first time, Crowe seemed to be truly listening, the evidence and arguments piercing through the defenses he had built around himself. When it was Crowe's turn to respond, he stood slowly, his posture stiff. He looked out at the courtroom, at the faces of the jurors, the reporters, and finally at Pam. "I have spent my career striving to maintain the integrity of the judiciary," he began, his voice steadier than his expression. "But I now realize that I allowed my personal beliefs to cloud my judgment in this matter. Ms. Bondi's arguments and the evidence presented today have shown me that I was wrong." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by an almost palpable silence. Crowe's words carried a sincerity that few had expected, and the acknowledgment of his mistake marked a dramatic turning point. "I hereby rescind the fine imposed on Ms. Bondi," Crowe continued, his voice quieter now. "Furthermore, I will submit myself to an internal review by the Judicial Ethics Committee. Justice must always be impartial, and I failed to uphold that standard." The courtroom erupted into applause, the sound filling the space like a wave. Pam stood silently for a moment, absorbing the significance of what had just happened. She turned to her legal team, exchanging a nod of quiet triumph. As the session adjourned, reporters rushed to capture her reaction, but Pam's focus remained on the principle she had fought for. This victory wasn't about personal vindication. It was about protecting the rights of everyone who might one day find themselves in a similar position. Pam Bondi sat in her office the evening after the hearing, staring out at the Chicago skyline bathed in the warm hues of twilight. The events of the last few weeks had been an emotional whirlwind, but today's victory marked a significant turning point, not just in her career, but in her personal understanding of resilience and justice. The news of Judge Crowe's apology and the courtroom's applause had spread like wildfire. Television networks and newspapers were reporting the story as a rare and powerful moment of judicial accountability. Pam's name was now synonymous with courage and principle, and her fight had inspired thousands to reflect on the importance of standing up for their rights. In the days that followed, letters and messages poured into her office. People shared their stories of facing discrimination, oppression, and injustice, expressing gratitude for her willingness to confront authority head-on. Pam made time to read every message, each one deepening her sense of purpose. She sat with Rachel one morning, sifting through the messages. One letter stood out, a handwritten note from a young law student. "I watched your case," it read. "Your courage reminded me why I chose this profession. The law isn't just about rules. It's about fighting for what's right." Pam smiled faintly. It was a reminder of why she had pursued law herself, driven by the belief that the courtroom was a place where truth and fairness could prevail. The movement sparked by her case extended beyond the courtroom. Advocates for religious freedom and constitutional rights rallied around the precedent Pam had set, using it to push for broader protections in workplaces, schools, and public institutions. Pam wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She had become a symbol of hope and strength for many. As she reflected on the journey, Pam couldn't help but think about Judge Crowe. Despite their conflict, she respected his willingness to acknowledge his mistake and take responsibility. It wasn't an easy decision, and it had shown her that even those entrenched in their own beliefs were capable of change. Pam looked out the window at the bustling city below, her silver cross resting lightly against her collarbone. She thought about the generations of people who had fought for their rights, who had endured hardship to ensure that justice prevailed. Their courage had paved the way for moments like this, moments when standing firm could change everything. She turned to Rachel and said, "It's not just about what happens in court. It's about the conversations that follow. We need to keep talking, keep pushing, and keep believing in the power of truth." Rachel nodded, her own conviction strengthened by Pam's words. Together, they began drafting a plan to use the case as a platform for education and advocacy, ensuring that the lessons learned would resonate far into the future. Pam knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always injustices to confront. But she also knew that her faith and her principles were stronger than ever. And as the skyline faded into the night, she felt ready to face whatever came next. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.